gastroenterologist with Gateway Gastroenterology at St. Luke's. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a talk called Eating Healthy in a Toxic World. And though I'm kind of a gastroenterologist by trade, I have a real interest in nutrition. And actually, I think, just to editorialize a little bit, I think medicine has gotten a little off track. We've become increasingly enamored with pharmaceuticals and procedures and really aren't looking at why we have the chronic health problems in this country that we have. And there's a lot of different issues, but what I'd like to concentrate on today is looking at some of the issues involved with the toxins in our environment, give you kind of an overview of what I see as some major issues, and then at the end give you some simple, straightforward ways to try to minimize the exposure to toxins in the environment. So, you know, when you look at healthcare today, as I'm sure most of you know, it's essentially become the management of chronic illnesses. You know, it's increasingly expensive, pharmaceutically based, and frequently we don't cure the problems. In fact, just the fact that we manage conditions, obviously in some ways that's wonderful. I mean, you look at people like Magic Johnson who have had AIDS now for over 20 years and still are alive. I would consider managing that to be a significant, wonderful achievement. But also when we manage other chronic diseases, you kind of need to step back a little bit and say, why are we managing these conditions and not trying to make them go away? And I think one of the things we really need to do is refocus our efforts on what has often been termed in the functional medicine world upstream medicine. You know, why is someone sick and how do we restore their health? And what we're going to talk about today is one of those areas is trying to avoid toxins. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate everybody in this room. You're part of the largest scientific experiment that has ever been undertaken. And the objective is to determine the effects of exposing humans to 100,000 synthetic chemicals while simultaneously radically altering their food supply and the environment in which they live. And by the way, no matter where you live on the planet, going to be increasingly an issue that our antibiotics are starting to fail. But certainly toxins are becoming more and more of a problem. Since World War II, 100,000 synthetic chemicals have been created and marketed. 20,000 are under secret patents for, quote, proprietary reasons, which maybe 50, 60 years ago made sense, but now you know, with back engineering, reverse engineering, any company can figure out what everybody else is doing in a week or two. The only reason today for proprietary patents are really to keep us from really knowing what's in a lot of preparations. 1,000 new chemicals are introduced each year. There are actually 3,000 different synthetic chemicals that are used in food products. And it was estimated that around World War II, there were 1 billion pounds of synthetic chemicals produced worldwide annually. It's now thought to be approaching 1 trillion pounds a year, which is really kind of a staggering number. More than 25,000 chemicals are used in the manufacture of cosmetics, and on average, the average American uses 9 personal skincare products involving 100 synthetic chemicals every morning. Just think of what you have in your bathroom when you get dressed every morning, all those skincare products and hair products. I mean, just read the labels and add it all up. You know, it's staggering the number of chemicals that are in there. One of the most concerning things is there's been various studies that have shown humans have literally hundreds of compounds in their fat. The estimates have been between 150 and 600 compounds in fat. And if you look at chemicals in 2 broad categories, they're either fat soluble or they're water soluble. If they're water soluble, if you ingest them, they possibly could kill you or damage you, but you're going to urinate them out and they're gone. The problem with fat soluble chemicals is once they get in your body, if they're not metabolized by your liver, they eventually get absorbed into fat cells where they can actually stay for decades. They found that in older people, they can biopsy their fat and find chemicals that were banned decades ago that are still there. And one of the most concerning things is they've looked at umbilical cord blood, you know, blood of newborn babies, and found as many as 200 toxic chemicals, or I should say that 200 chemicals in their blood, of which we really don't know which ones are toxic or not toxic. Tap water contains dozens of synthetic chemicals. You know, our water purification systems do remove some chemicals, but what they're really designed to do is remove pathogens, you know, bacteria, viruses, and all. And there's been studies that have shown that if you look at water that goes into a processing system, certainly the number of chemicals has declined between the untreated water and the treated water, but there's still many chemicals remaining. Again, which ones are hazardous to us, nobody really knows. To shift gears a little, you look at how our livestock is raised, given hormones, antibiotics, they're fed such things as corn, pet animal remains, chicken feces. You know, cows are ruminants. They're not meant to eat corn. They're not meant to eat these things. And, you know, raising sick animals and then eating them obviously is not a recipe for good health for us, animals, or the environment. You know, GMOs are certainly a topic that's very controversial, especially in a city like St. Louis. You can argue whether they harm us or the environment, but you know, you look at most of our foods now, and in the grain areas, they're virtually all genetically modified. Soy is 93%, corn 88%. Wheat, a lot of people think is genetically modified. It is not, though it has been created. They're testing it, and I suspect it will only be a matter of time until genetically modified wheat is available. If you eat any kind of processed food, almost assuredly, you are consuming genetically modified foods. What's been termed Farmageddon, as I mentioned earlier, antibiotic use has led to an increasing number of so-called superbugs that are no longer sensitive to our antibiotics, as well as these antibiotics are clearly altering our gut flora. And I think even in the newspapers and all, people more and more are talking about the fact that that our gut flora, our gut bacteria are so important to our health. And when it's altered, it's beginning to look like it causes a lot of problems: obesity, diabetes, dementia. I mean, a whole list, depression. That you know, we really are in a very close symbiotic relation with the bacteria that lives in our intestines. There's at least 100,000 hospital-related deaths a year due to adverse drug reactions, and now pharmaceuticals kill more people than motor vehicle accidents. So in truth, you know, a lot of that is due to overdoses, but still, these are things we're prescribing that are then causing problems. If you look at any stream in America, you'll find all kinds of pharmaceuticals. You know, what do they tell you to do with your drugs when they're done? A lot of people say, well, just flush them down the toilet. Well, ultimately, they end up in the water supply. Also, a lot of the pharmaceuticals we take are not altered in our body. They go in one end, out the other end, and then they're in the water supply where they can still have their pharmaceutical effects on wildlife. I'm actually a beekeeper, and I can tell you that the effects of environmental changes on beekeeping as well as pollinators in general has been devastating. The government just came out this year and said that last year, 42% of all honeybee hives did not survive the winter. The typical historic has been 15 to 20%. Many causes for that. Probably the number one is this nasty mite called the Varroa destructor mite that is in virtually every hive in the country. Very hard to eradicate. But also it's felt that there's a component of this due to pesticide use and loss of habitat. But as Einstein said almost 80 years ago, that if we lose bees, we're all going to be dead in about 4 years. You know, in other areas, I think probably read about what's happened with the monarch butterfly. Their numbers are down considerably, though over the last year they do seem to have come up. But again, pollinators are such an important part of our food chain, and they're kind of the canary in the coal mine. As you notice them declining, I think you obviously can see what that can do to the rest of our food supply. One of the major problems with chemicals is that may have what's called synergistic amplified negative effects, which means that basically if one chemical is bad and two chemicals are put together are bad, the two of them together may not be twice as bad than either one separate. It may be that they're 10 times as bad. It's more of a multiplicative effect. Many of these chemicals are active in only a few parts per billion, which is just an exceedingly small amount. It's been estimated that if you filled up a stadium like Busch Stadium with water and dropped like a cap full of a chemical in there, that would be what a few billion parts or a few parts per billion is. Another problem is many of these compounds, we lack adequate ways to get them out of our body once they're ingested. Our liver may not detoxify them and get rid of them, and they can be there forever. As with anything with children, and I think this is one of the most concerning areas, toxicity is obviously much worse. There's been many studies looking at this, but this was one where they did in vitro, which means in a test tube. They took 4 common food additives, MSG, aspartame, a couple of food colorings, put them together in concentrations that would typically be found in the bloodstream after having a snack and a drink, and they found that in the test tube it altered neuronal development. Now, obviously, that's not the same as in a human or an animal, but it certainly gives you pause for thought. And though, no one has directly linked any toxins with the rise in neurocognitive defects or issues with children, I think it certainly is something that needs to be addressed, that many of these compounds may be adversely affecting children. And, if you think about it, if a woman, is using drugs or drinking alcohol during pregnancy, I mean, that's essentially against the law and certainly is, societally now highly frowned upon. But no one really thinks about all the other things of women put in their body when they're pregnant, and we don't even give it a thought. But some of those may be potentially very, very dangerous. Well, the chemical world says that things are a little different. The mere detection of a chemical does not necessarily indicate a risk to health, and that's absolutely true. I'm not saying that every single chemical that's found in a person is dangerous. In fact, many of them probably are not. The problem is we really don't know which chemicals are dangerous and which are not. And if you think about it, if you wanted to figure it out, you'd have to take every synthetic chemical, run it through a million tests in lab rats and find out, does it cause cardiovascular disease, neurologic disease, cancer, et cetera, and then when you were done with that, you'd then have to combine it with other chemicals and say, well, maybe if one doesn't cause a problem, well, maybe 2 of them do, and then do all that. Obviously, it just becomes prohibitively, logistically impossible. The other problem, too, is we know that all kinds of animals, their livers detoxify chemicals differently than humans. So even if you found something in a rat or didn't find something, it doesn't necessarily mean it relates to people. So you're never going to really be able to figure out exactly how these chemicals affect us. So I think the more important thing is, rather than, kind of saying that the mere detection of a chemical does not necessarily indicate a health risk, the bigger thing to say is lack of evidence of toxicity is not the same as evidence of lack of toxicity. And so what I mean by that is, a lot of times they'll say, well, there's no evidence that this causes, disease X, Y, or Z. And you're like, you're absolutely right. But did you ever do the study to prove it? And the answer to that may be no. So just because there's no evidence doesn't mean that something is safe. And I think that's a very typical play on words that can be used to kind of disarm the arguments. To kind of change gears, and by the way, this talk is kind of a little all over the place because there's a lot of different things I want to talk about, but there's an increasing understanding that toxicity and obesity may be related. And there's a term that's been coined over the last 7 or 8 years in the medical literature that I think most people have not heard of, called an obesogen. And what that is a dietary, industrial, or pharmaceutical compound that can alter metabolic pathways and predispose people to gain weight. Part of it can happen in a child in development, that it can actually differentiate cells or stem cells so that they become fat cells. So basically, as the embryo develops and the cells divide, however it works by the miracle, cell decides, and this one's a liver cell, and this one's a kidney cell, and these are going to be fat cells. These chemicals can influence the development to say, instead of being a brain cell, why don't you be a fat cell? And so these kids are actually born with a larger number of fat cells than other children who haven't been exposed to those chemicals. And that's been shown in animals. Also, the size of the fat cells increases. And then in adults or, people who are born, there's alterations in appetite, satiety, and energy metabolism. So there's many different ways that chemicals can predispose to someone being fat. But, one thing we know that children who are born to mothers who are overweight typically have an increased risk of being overweight. Now, obviously, that could be due to dietary factors, lifestyle within the family, but it also may be set right from the beginning just because of the changes in the child in utero. This is always a little hard to see, but what it looks at is just the various obesogens that are known out there. I mean, I don't think it's a surprise that fructose is, but glycine, which is part of soy, monosodium glutamate. Nicotine is interesting. It may be part of the fact we all know that when people quit smoking, they gain weight. It could in part be the fact that cigarette smoke is very complex, and that it may be that when some of the more short-lived compounds in cigarette smoke is gone, the longer remaining ones that hang around may actually predispose people to being overweight. Many different chemicals, BPA, phthalates, which we'll talk about, pesticides, but certainly there's a lot of things in the environment that can predispose to obesity. And this is a very interesting concept, and I don't expect you to read all this, but this is this is something that is not just some new age idea that's out there and on the internet. But interesting question: is obesity just because of overconsumption of food and lack of exercise, or is it actually a defensive biological adaptation? And if you think about what the theory is here, is that you ingest some type of a chemical. It's fat soluble. Your liver does not, for whatever reason, adequately metabolize it so you can get rid of it, because again, you cannot urinate out fat-soluble chemicals. And then the body sees this nasty chemical swimming around in your blood and says, it's not really good for my vital organs, my heart, my lungs, my kidneys, and all to be exposed to this chemical. Let's wall it off in a fat cell. So makes a fat cell, walls off the toxic chemical. Well, obviously, if this is happening over and over again, it may predispose you to obesity. So I don't think we've ever thought of obesity or fat as being a positive thing, but it may actually be the lesser of two evils. And this is an interesting study where basically what they did, I wish I had a pointer, but what they did is took a group of people who were very overweight. They had a BMI of 50, which I suspect most of you know what BMIs are, but basically your BMI should be below 25. So on the left, they had a group of people, they were men who had on average a BMI of 50. They did gastric bypass on them, and their BMI went from 50 to 25 on average. So they had a very good response to the bypass surgery. But on the graph on the right, they looked at a particular obesogen, organochlorine, and they looked at what happened to the blood levels of it as they lost weight. So first of all, you can see on the right-hand bars, even at baseline, before they underwent bypass, they still had some degree of this in their bloodstream. But look what happens after surgery. The level went up 3 to 4-fold. So they've actually become more toxic as they've lost weight. And this has been shown with other chemicals, and it brings up the possibility of one of the many reasons why there's yo-yo dieting. Now, there's many reasons why people have a vicious cycle. I mean, it's hard to diet. There's all the visual cues of eating. There's psychosocial reasons. I mean, there's reasons people lose weight and gain it back. And in fact, if you really look at it, the issue is in this country, it's not losing weight. It's really keeping the weight off that's so important. But the theory here is the schematic on the left, on our left, is an overweight person. The little dots are toxins. So they're overweight and they have toxins. They then lose weight, so they're a smaller body size, but as you can see, they're actually more toxic now. And so then the body says, this is really not good. Let's just start making fat cells so we can start walling off these toxins again and get them away from our vital organs. So basically, you kind of have this repetitive type of process, and unless you can get rid of the toxins, you're never going to be able to break the cycle. Another very interesting and concerning thing is the fact that it appears that some of these obesogens can actually alter your DNA, and it can be passed on from generation to generation. When I was in med school 30 years ago or so, we were basically told that the only way that you had evolution was your DNA actually had to change. Now we're realizing that there's a lot of genes that are turned on and off. You don't always express the same genes all the time. And in fact, the proof of that is cancer. Obviously, genes get turned on that cause cell growth that's not supposed to be there. So the same kind of thing with this. These genes can be turned on that make you obese. And interestingly now, they're finding in animals that if you turn these genes on through various chemicals, it is passed on from generation to generation. Again, part of that idea that obesity within families may just not be lifestyle, but also can be alterations in the mother's DNA. Very, very frightening idea. To change topics, but along the same line is, how many of you have heard of the term endocrine disruptor? Few people. This, I think, may be one of the most concerning thing out there. And the definition of that is it's a substance that causes adverse health effects in a body secondary to changes in endocrine function. And basically, it boils all down to these are compounds in the environment that mimic estrogen. And as I said, many of these compounds, especially these estrogen mimickers, can be active at just a few parts per billion. And there's some very sobering statistics about this. There's been a dramatic decline in the age of onset of breast development in young girls. 15% now begin at the age of 8. For some reason in Puerto Rico, 25% of girls are developing breasts now in the 3rd grade. They don't know what's going on, but there's some toxin or whatnot that's causing that. One of the most concerning things is when they've gone into various estuaries like the Chesapeake Bay and they've harvested clams or oysters, they're finding that a lot of the males have what's called ambiguous genitalia, where genetically they're XY, but when they look at the genitalia, in some way they're male, some way they're female, but regardless of what they look like, they're all sterile. And, it doesn't take a marine biologist to realize that if you sterilize the lower end of your food chain, the effects of that on the higher end of the food chain, including us, is not good. The average sperm count of American men has gone down by 50% in the last 50 years. And here's a study in Europe, the testicular cancer in England has doubled over the last about 35 to 40 years. There's great debate about prostate cancer and breast cancer as to whether the rates of those are going up. Part of that is really hard to tease out in that our diagnostic ability has gotten so much better, especially with prostate cancer. So is the incidence really increasing, or is it just we're getting better at detecting it? But, one thing that's certainly true is I just saw a very healthy young lady in the office yesterday. She's 35, runs marathons, eats healthy food. She had breast cancer at 28. We see this now not uncommonly. And I was talking to a radiation oncologist I knew who was in her 60s, and she said, when I was a young woman just starting medicine, breast cancer was a disease of older women. Now, we don't really bat an eye when you see a 25, 30, 35-year-old woman. Something has changed, and yes, we have BRCA genes and all, but those have been around forever. Something is turning those genes on. And in fact, she said the youngest breast cancer she saw was 18. There's obviously something going on there. One of the most concerning endocrine disruptors are something called phthalates. It looks like it'll be phthalates, but it's pronounced phthalates. And these are a petroleum byproduct that is used in about everything, clothing, cosmetics, insecticides, etc. And one of the major things they do is make plastics pliable. If you think about your shower curtain, how it's, pliable, if you didn't have phthalates, your shower curtain would be like a sheet of glass. So they're very useful. But it's estimated now that there's about 5 million metric tons produced around the world. And they've been linked to multiple different endocrine disorders that I've put there, as you can guess, are particularly dangerous in utero, and again, are effective in only a few parts per billion. And I think this may be one of the worst offenders out there, just if nothing else, because of the fact that we use so much of them. They're very effective for what they're designed for, but they may have a dark side to them. So again, to switch gears, we talked about the problems of toxins, but what about some other problems? Well, our food is not what it was before. We do a lot of plant breeding, and I'm not even talking about genetic modification. What I'm talking about is just the typical plant hybridization that has been done by farmers for generations or eons. But typically, when this is done, it's done to increase the size, growth rate, other agricultural or commercial effects. Making sure that things don't rot as quickly when they're being shipped from California or whatever. All these things are wonderful. I'm not saying they're bad, but they're very rare that anything is hybridized to try to increase their nutritional value. Another problem is our soil in many cases has been very depleted. It turns out, soil is a very live, active thing, with worms and bacteria and fungus and yeast. All this stuff's supposed to be there. When you continually hit these fields with herbicides and pesticides and all, you essentially sterilize the fields. And the bacteria are very important. What they often do is they take inorganic compounds like calcium and phosphorus, make them into a form that can then be absorbed by the plant. And so when there's no bacteria, the plant often does not uptake as much of the vital minerals that are needed. And, the USDA has even looked at this, and they found that over the last 50 years, there's been a marked decrease in many of the healthy compounds in our fruits and vegetables. Here's a study, and actually projects pretty well, but this is looking at from 1914 to 1992, and I suspect that it's no different if you go now another 20 years. But you look down the right-hand side, and you see the change in the mineral content of these various minerals is pretty striking. Iron is 96%, magnesium 82%. It's very concerning. This is a study where they took the average mineral content of selected vegetables. So they looked at calcium, magnesium, and iron in a combination of cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach. And again, you can see just a dramatic decline in the amount of minerals in our fruits and vegetables. So I'm not saying don't eat fruits and vegetables are the best thing that's out there, but what we're eating now is probably a lot different than what our parents and grandparents ate decades ago. And it does clearly seem to be better in organic fields because, again, with the organic growing techniques, you probably have a healthier soil. But this is a concern in terms of, large-scale commercial production. And not to kind of overdo it, but kind of a busy slide, but it also shows in our meat supply, same kind of thing. If you look at beef and chicken, I won't run through all of it, but suffice it to say a lot of their nutrient value has declined, which, again, is not surprising if you've ever been to a feedlot, how these animals are fed. I mean, garbage in, garbage out. Another problem with nutrient deficiency is it all kind of comes together. You have to have nutrients in order to detoxify things. The main way you detoxify compounds is in your liver, just like that's where you typically detoxify pharmaceuticals and get rid of them. It's where you get rid of any toxin. But your liver, the enzyme pathways that do the detoxification are very well known. They've been known for decades. It's called the P450 system, and they need a lot of micronutrients in order to function appropriately, and those are kind of listed here. And if we're lacking a lot of those, then typically the system does not work as well, you don't detoxify as well, and hence you don't get rid of as many bad compounds. The last thing is just genetically modified. Again, here in St. Louis, probably great controversy about it. There's no doubt when you look at what Monsanto and others have done in terms of GMO, in terms of increasing crop yield. Man who lived in my neighborhood, he's since moved, but he spent 3 years working in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, etc., and said, I brought into these subsistence farms these genetically modified plants that fought drought, fought pests and whatnot, and was able to increase their yields by 40–50%, which meant people weren't starving to death. So there's nothing inherently evil about genetically modified crops in any way, and in fact, there's a lot of ways to do well, but I'm not sure we necessarily know all the effects yet. Certainly, as a first go, it appears that when you look at animals that have been raised on them, they have normal weight, organ size, blood tests, fertility, mortality, but at a closer look, there may be some microscopic organ damage. So you can actually, look under the microscope at the, say the liver or the kidney. There have been some studies saying, things don't look normal here. Now it gets more complicated because remember, one of the ways that these genetically modified crops work is that you can spray them with pesticides so that they're pesticide resistant, so it makes it easier to lay down the pesticides. And maybe what you're really looking at is that you have just residual pesticide on the food they're consuming. So it's a very complicated problem, and I'm not, it's like everything. There's very few, black and white. Everything's kind of gray in the middle. But I think certainly the whole question of where GMO stands in terms of overall health in the environment is still open to debate, and there aren't a lot of huge studies that are looking at it. Just a couple other quick things that you could spend a whole week conference on is I think we've all heard about inflammation. When I was in med school, inflammation was, you cut your arm and got the little red area where it healed up. That was inflammation. Now we realize that inflammation is probably the core of everything. And in fact, I think when the final word is written, we're going to find out that the last 25–30 years of chasing cholesterol with statin drugs has probably all been an epiphenomenon, and the vast majority of our cardiovascular disease is inflammatory in nature. But inflammation is really the root of just about all our diseases. Again, it kind of all ties into poor diet, toxicity, obesity. Another area is stress. Again, what is stress? It's, physical, it's mental, but certainly we live in an extremely stressful environment. Look at the stress of 20% of American workers now work shift work. We're meant to kind of work all day, and then the sun went down and go to sleep and get up and do it the next day. I mean, all of our normal circadian rhythms have been altered. And one last thing just to touch on briefly is our food has become increasingly acidic. It turns out that primitive man probably had a diet that was 6 to 9 times more alkaline than our present diet, and highly acidic foods tend to increase osteoporosis. And look at what some of the worst foods are: carbonated beverages, animal protein, and grains, gluten. I mean, if that's basically a fast food meal there. And the best foods in terms of having an alkaline diet, again, gee, surprise, vegetables and fruit. Just one thing is it's really pushed hard by the dairy industry that milk can help with osteoporosis. There's actually almost no evidence to support that. In fact, there's even contradictory evidence that if you look epidemiologically at populations that have the highest milk consumption tend to have the highest rates of osteoporosis. The best way to get calcium is through plant-based green leafy vegetables, things like that, where they're in a more biologically active form. So these are kind of our modern scourges. That was very quick, but I think it does give you an overview. Toxicity, obesity, inflammation, stress, malnutrition, and acidity. And, it's kind of a tangled web. It's not a straight line linear type of thing where, all you need to do is find one little area, A going to B, and if you can, interrupt A from going to B, you solved everything. It's all very confusing. Obesity causes inflammation, inflammation causes obesity, toxicity causes obesity, et cetera, and it's very, very complicated. One other thing I'd add in there that I didn't kind of put in the whole thing is sleep deprivation is a huge problem. I alluded to, shift work, but Americans also, tend to have disrupted sleep. And, really, if you look at that, that is what we're dealing with in healthcare. This is kind of what healthcare in the United States has been becoming. How do we prevent all of these problems from causing the sickness we see in Americans? And, I think it's pretty clear that throwing, kind of dropping in this little pill, pharmaceuticals, is not going to break that complex web. So that's kind of the bad part, and you're probably thinking, God, why did I waste my lunch to hear this Debbie Downer guy come in here and tell me all these horrible things? Well, what can you do? Well, you could move to Alaska. The problem is that won't work. I mean, with sea currents and wind currents, this stuff is all mixed up all over, as well as, bottom line is you can go almost any, island in the world and you're going to find, products, consumer products from Europe, America, Asia, whatever. So, the stuff's everywhere. You can't get away from it. Obviously, there are areas, you're going to be healthier in Alaska than you are going to be in the center of some, urban city, say Beijing or somewhere with terrible pollution. Well, one thing you do is you could wait for the chemical, agricultural, and pharmaceutical industries in conjunction with the government to solve the problem. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. But really, if you look at it, and again, one of the problems I see in the environmentalists and whatnot is I hate to vilify people. It's not, I don't think that anybody got up one day and said, let's figure out a way to really, really mess up the world. I think a lot of this is just the unintended consequences. It's been estimated that if we wanted to get rid of this toxicity, what we need to do is go back to living like we did around the time of the American Civil War. And I don't think any of us are really that keen on giving up all of the comforts we have. You just look around and, computers and aviation and automobiles, but they do come with a price. And this is basically the life we like, and nobody really wants to give it up. So what do we really do about it within those constraints? And I think I like the Serenity prayer, which perhaps most of you use or, know kind of from the 12-step programs. But, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Or probably more succinctly, it is what it is. So this is kind of the environment and the world we live in. And I'm not saying that, government and industry should not improve what they're doing. It's very encouraging to understand, companies like McDonald's are making healthier foods. You certainly hear about various companies trying to be good stewards, making their manufacturing processes greener. I am 100% all for that. But I think ultimately on a day-to-day basis, we need to take care of ourselves. So what can you do? Well, pretty much, you're in charge of your health and your family's health, and it really comes down to you on the short term and the long run. The major number one thing you can do is increase your consumption of fruits and vegetables. This is really the major thing. And, I have people say to me all the time, tell me, what should I do to eat healthier? And, you can have whole conferences, obviously, on what is the appropriate diet. And you can argue about all kinds of nuances of how much fat you should have and whether man should be a vegan or a vegetarian or paleo diet. But anybody who's sensible will tell you that probably the two biggest problems in America are people don't eat enough fruits and vegetables and they eat too much processed food. If you change that, pretty much all of the health issues in this country go away. It's estimated that 70% of American calories now that are consumed are processed food. So eat lots and lots of fruits and vegetables. As I say, eat the rainbow. If you have an option of eating, say, 3 apples as compared to an apple, a pear, and an orange, eat the combination. They all have various, phytonutrients and all that are a little different. Smaller fruits and vegetables tend to be more nutrient dense. Try to get more stuff that is locally grown. And first of all, I really like to help the small farmers. Food co-ops, grow your own. It's amazing what you can grow in a 10 by 10 little place. You can't support your whole family, but I also think it kind of gets you back to the land. And having a little garden is a wonderful thing to do. If you can't get fresh, choose frozen over canned. People always ask me, well, what's the best way to get the pesticides and all? And there's all these companies selling all these scrubs and all. The best thing to do is just kind of scrub them under cold water. There is some evidence that salt water may be a little more effective, but just scrubbing them under cold water will work. Consume as soon as you can so the nutrient level doesn't go down. If you're going to cook them, don't overcook them. And selectively choose organic. And this is a question, too, of, what about organic versus inorganic? Or I should say organic or non-organic. The problem with the organic is that it's expensive. There's no doubt it costs more. So what can you do? Well, it's interesting. I heard a man speaking. It was an interesting thing he said. If every American in this country, every American ate one more serving of fruits and vegetables a day, there'd be 20,000 less cases of cancer. But if these foods were typical, commercially grown, had pesticides involved in them, because of eating that one more fruit or vegetable, there would be 10 more cases of cancer. So you'd have 20,000 less from eating more of it, but there'd be 10 people who'd be unlucky. So again, don't worry about the pesticides. Scrub them, eat them, and don't worry about it. But if you do want to get a little more specific, there's something out there, and you can find this on the internet. It's the Clean 15 versus the Dirty Dozen. And what this is looking at is, if you go across the board, what are the foods that tend to have the highest amount of pesticides and chemicals on them? And if you're going to, use your food dollars wisely, maybe buy the Dirty Dozen organically, and then the other ones, the Clean 15, don't worry about. They tend to be pretty clean. And if you look at them as a group, the Clean 15 tend to be ones that have thicker rinds, like a watermelon. It kind of makes sense. No matter what they spray on them, it's not going to matter. And some of them just tend to be things that, for whatever reason, they don't tend to have a lot of natural pest problems, so they don't get hit with a lot of pesticides. But I always think it's amazing on the Dirty Dozen, if you look at what is the worst thing out there, it's an apple. And, what does every good mom do on the way to school is give their child an apple, and it turns out that apples have a lot of pesticides on them. So, this is something that, like I said, if you just Google Dirty Dozen, you can actually find this and print it out. So this is not a bad way to wisely choose your dollars. So what about livestock? Well, first of all, I think generally Americans eat way too much meat, and that's really starting. I think the evidence on that is becoming overwhelming. That red meat is probably the worst, but just in general, Americans eat too much animal protein. But if you are going to eat it, the more you can buy grass and range fed that are not given antibiotics or hormones, is definitely better for you. If you can find, certainly the ones that carry the organic stamp, and also ones like the ones that are animal welfare approved, where actually the animals are kept in a humane environment. Again, if you've ever been to a feedlot, it's a pretty sobering experience. I think a lot of us don't really want to know what these chicken houses and feedlots look like. They're pretty disturbing. Milk and eggs, same thing. Free-range chickens tend to have higher levels of good fatty acids, the so-called omega-3s. They're not, and if you're going to have milk from cows, this is another area where I think it's worthwhile to eat organic. Run-of-the-mill milk has a lot of bovine growth hormone in it. And again, the USDA comes out and will tell you that bovine growth hormone is completely healthy. There's not a lot of studies to back that up. And there's some very big concerns about what all that growth hormone is doing in kids. I think you're really better off buying organic milk that does not come from animals that have been routinely given antibiotics or growth hormone. And that, that's not a big expense difference between the two of those. I'd also say that, a lot of people don't think about it, but, we are the only animal on the planet that consumes other animals' milk. And no other animal consumes milk after weaning. So, milk is really not that big of a need in our diet. Contrary to what the dairy industry wants to show, really kids don't need huge amounts of milk. You can get protein and other, vitamins and whatnot from other sources. So it's not a necessary part of anybody's diet. Fish, I think it's obvious, wild caught is better than farm raised. They tend to have lower levels of pollutants and higher level of omega-3 fatty acids. Some of the worst fish out there are swordfish, shark, tilefish, but especially swordfish is one of the worst. Basically what happens in terms of mercury toxicity, the bigger the animal gets, the bigger the fish gets, the more it tends to have been around for a long time and concentrated more mercury in its in its meat. So the ones on the left tend to be the ones that are healthiest, and I think those are common ones that Americans eat. Obviously, salmon with its omega-3s is probably the healthiest of all, though again, there's the expense problem. Legumes, beans are an excellent source of protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals. I think, anybody would be wise to increase the amount of beans they have in their diet. If you wanted to use a protein supplement, having said that, milk as itself is not a great thing to be taking huge amounts of, whey protein, which is a constituent of milk, turns out to be a very healthy protein when it's derived from the milk and taken separately. There's different ways to remove whey protein or separate whey protein from milk, and you want to get one that's called cold extracted and undenatured, which just means they don't harm the general protein molecule, the whey molecules, when they're extracting them. And interestingly, when you look at whey, it's a very superior protein. What the government has come up with is something called biological value. And what that is if you look at a protein, there's many reasons you want to eat protein, but one of them is, maintaining or gaining muscle mass. And so they'll, you take so many ounces of meat or any kind of a protein, you ingest them, and then you see, well, how much of that then gets incorporated into your muscles. And by definition or arbitrarily, they made whole egg 100. So they said arbitrarily, we'll put egg at 100, we'll compare everything. The only protein that was found to maintain and build muscle mass better than egg was whey protein. And you can see as you look down the list that the animal proteins tend to be intermediate and the plant proteins tend to be lowest. Now that doesn't mean that plant proteins are bad, it just means they're not quite as good, and actually it gets more complicated. If you combine different plant proteins together, you can actually, by putting them together, bring their biological value up. One of the things I do point out is soy, in terms of biological value, is not nearly as good as whey and egg. And if you kind of think about it, it makes sense. Whey protein comes from milk, obviously egg comes from egg. That's what mom is making to pass on to her newborn offspring to give them the best chance to survive. So she's going to make the best protein she possibly can. So it all kind of evolutionarily, biologically makes sense that whey protein and egg protein would be some of the best proteins there are. And basically there's a lot of things that whey protein does. Enhances fat burning, maintains and builds muscle mass, increases detoxification. It turns out that whey protein directly affects the liver and helps it to detoxify chemicals. Again, it gets all back into that, everything's connected, improves glucose control and diabetes, lipid profile, and also tends to keep you full. So there's a lot of reasons if people are interested in using a supplement, whey protein is not a bad way to go. Though again, you don't have to, there's certainly many other ways to get protein. Grains, not a big fan of lots and lots of soy or wheat. I'm not saying that they are bad. In fact, you can have a whole conference again on the pros and cons of whether soy protein is good for you. But I think the important point is that we never were meant to eat huge amounts of grain. And, Americans, it's estimated, eat 130 pounds of wheat flour a year. And as an aside, eat 100 pounds of sugar a year. The average American is eating about 200 to 250 pounds of sugar and wheat. And we wonder why people are overweight and have all the medical issues that they do. So again, wheat, if you're going to eat it, a whole wheat, whole grain is healthy. Soy in small amounts probably does have some positive effects in terms of it may even decrease the risk of breast cancer, though that is very controversial. But the point is, it should not be the major staple of your diet. People who consume huge amount of bread products and pastas and all, it's really not that nutrient dense. I mean, if you can substitute that for fruits and vegetables, you're a lot better off. Or some of the cleaner grains, actually quinoa has become very popular, and actually is a very, very healthy grain. Fats and oils are another area, we have gone full circle now. 40 years ago, the government came out and said that fat was bad for you and told everybody, decrease fat and increase carbohydrate consumption. And it's interesting when you look at that, about the time the government told us to do that is about the time that the obesity epidemic began. So carbohydrates, large amounts of carbohydrates are really are not good for you. Large amounts of carbohydrates in fruits and vegetables are good, but large amounts of processed carbohydrates are not. And likewise, these oils like margarine turn out to be very bad. Corn oil, soy oil. Canola oil actually can go on either side. The reason I put canola oil on the bad side is almost all of it in America now is genetically modified. But if you get non-genetically modified, it actually is pretty healthy. But the bottom line is the best way to get fats and oils are nuts and seeds, real butter, olive oil, coconut oil. But I think one of the things important is you don't need a lot of oil. I mean, there's been a lot of this hype about having lots and lots of coconut oil and all. Human beings were never meant to consume lots and lots of fats and oil. In moderation is very important. In fact, you do need to have some oils. People who really, really restrict them probably do it at their own peril. There's no evidence that you need fats to keep your brain healthy. But the point is, modest amounts of healthy fats is important. And the most important thing is, I think you've probably all heard of the hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, the so-called trans fatty acids. Those things are really, really bad for you, and even relatively small amounts. And if you see anything that, on the label says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, I would just not eat that at all. Pharmaceuticals, I had the privilege of training at Hopkins, and one of the founders of Hopkins 100 years ago was a man named William Osler, who died literally almost 100 years ago, and to this day he's still frequently quoted. His views on medicine will be around forever. He's kind of like an Aristotle or Hippocrates. But one of the things he said is one of the first duties of the physician is to educate the masses not to take medicines. I mean, the number of medicines Americans on has skyrocketed, and certainly some of these are wonderful and have a very positive effect. But I think the ones that really are being overused are the so-called PPIs. The acid-reducing medicines, omeprazole, they're grossly overused. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen, naproxen, those things are fine on a short term. You have a headache and you take a couple ibuprofen, that's great. But they were never meant to take long term, and there's a lot of downsides on them in terms of affecting your stomach, your kidneys, your intestines. SSRIs, which are the antidepressants, the Prozac class, those things also probably grossly overused. The amount of evidence that they help with mild depression is about zero. They seem to be extremely effective for people who have severe, profound, major depression. But for the typical person, I'm kind of blue, there's very little evidence they work. And I think we're really realizing that we have overdone it on antibiotics. So, I mean, these are things to consider avoiding. And I'm not, it's not a blanket like go home and throw them all out, but I'm just saying that one of the things I tell everybody you should do is at least once a year, sit down with your primary care doctor and say, look, I'm on all this stuff. Do I really need all this stuff? And if I do, well, what can I do to get off of it? Can I, lose weight? Can I, dietary changes? But Americans I think, are on twice as many pharmaceuticals now as they were 10 to 15 years ago. And obviously our health is not twice as good as it was 10 to 15 years ago. If you can drink filtered water, you actually can do that pretty easily. Get a Brita, one of those filters, and just put them on your faucet. It does take out a number of compounds. Soda is kind of bad news, both regular and diet. In fact, I think if you had a choice, diet soda may be worse. The artificial sweeteners like aspartame and sucralose, they truly are toxins. And in fact, aspartame or NutraSweet is actually a neurotoxin. There's no doubt about it. And there was actually a very strong effort when it was licensed 30 years ago to keep it off the market, but they failed. I would minimize fructose, as I said, artificial sweeteners. Honey is a good source of sweetness. So again, honey is a very heavy sugar. It's not something that should be consumed in huge amounts. If you do want a safe, non-toxic, non-caloric sweetener, stevia is really the best. One thing to be careful of is Truvia. Truvia is not stevia, and they did a wonderful marketing job. People think, oh, Truvia is stevia. It's not. It's an artificial sweetener. So if you're using Truvia, I'd change to stevia. There's no doubt that toxins are absorbed through our skin. For people with makeup and all, you may want to look at using more natural brands. Another thing are toxins. I ride my bike a lot, and I used to clean my bike, and my hands would look like this guy's. And now I just wear a pair of gloves. I mean, we know that these solvents will drive things right into your bloodstream. So avoiding those kind of things, minimizing them is very, very important. And, I can't say enough about the ink craze in this country. Whether you find it aesthetically pleasing or not is another question. But, the government has done a very good job of decreasing the rate of viral transmission. People aren't getting hepatitis B or C or HIV from needles anymore because of government making sure these tattoo parlors are safe. But there is absolutely no regulation of what is in the inks. And one of the main things they use to stabilize the colors are phthalates, remember the estrogen mimickers. So can you imagine you're injecting yourself with an estrogen mimicker? These things don't ever go away. You basically have now made a reservoir that's going to slowly leach this stuff into your bloodstream. Is it safe? Who knows? But it's never been looked at, and I think it's a little concerning. Exercise, I think, goes without saying, is a very important part of health. Both a combination of, aerobic exercise, but also some resistance training. You don't have to be a musclehead, but just some light weights and all. One of the things, as you get to be over 40, your muscle mass starts to decline at about a half pound to a pound a year. And if you don't do something to kind of slow that down, you can end up with a markedly lower muscle mass by the time you're 70. But exercise and adequate healthy protein can change that. I'm sorry. One of the other, it's kind of my pet peeve, is the amount of stuff we use in our yards. It's really just a horrible thing. I've often wanted to do an experiment where you took a development, a neighborhood, and asked everybody for a year to go buy everything at Lowe's or Home Depot that they're going to put on their yard, but don't put it on their yard, just pile it up in the front yard, and then come back at the end of the year and see how much stuff is there. And unfortunately, what you're seeing there with that, everybody's look at that yard and go, oh, that's beautiful, and it is beautiful, but nature was never meant to be a monoculture. Everything was supposed to be a diversity of species, and that's not normal. And that's why there's constantly weeds and all. And every time there's a dandelion, we got to run out there and hit it with some chemical. I have a friend who's a farmer, and he said, there's a lot of difference between you city folks and us out in the country. But one of the things is we have yards and you have lawns. He said, I have a yard. I got a tractor and I cut it every now and then, and the dog's out there and the kids play baseball in it, and our yard doesn't look like your lawn. So I think kind of trying to minimize all of these compounds that we use for purely aesthetic reasons is not a bad idea. And I also think part of toxicity is we live in an increasingly disconnected world, and I think a wonderful book to read if you want. There's so many good books out there, but one of them's gotten a lot of play lately. Have you heard of the new book out already called Blue Zones? Basically, they've looked at 4 cultures in the world where people have 3 times the rate of living to over 100. It's Okinawans, a group in Costa Rica, Sardinians, a certain part of the Sardinian island, and then actually the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. And they look through all of them, and if you look, there is a basic continuum. They all have about the same thing, and what it is a highly plant-based diet with minimal amounts of any meat, lots of general exercise. They're not going to the gym. Their exercise is from walking and herding and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing they found that perhaps is more important than all of that is social structure. People who are isolated and don't have strong family and friend bonds, they die earlier. I mean, faith, family, friends is a very, very important part of combating the hyper, world we live in today. So that's a lot of information to throw at you, and I appreciate you listening. But if I had to sum it all up, I'd say, the number one thing is eat lots of vegetables, fruits, beans, seeds, and nuts. Minimize processed food. Cut down on animal protein. It should be an occasional, not an everyday type of thing. Use healthy oil sparingly, and consciously try to avoid environmental toxins. And I'll end again with Sir William Osler from Hopkins, and he had many wonderful quotes, but another one was, the philosophy of one age have become the absurdities of the next, and the foolishness of yesterday has become the wisdom of tomorrow. And I think in decades to come, they're going to look back at us and they're going to say, gee, you knew exactly what was going on here, and you basically tried to fight your way out of this with a bunch of pharmaceutical chemicals and all, without really looking and saying, why do we have all these problems? And it's all kind of foolish. And until we really get serious about addressing these nutritional and toxic issues, we can keep making pharmaceuticals. It's not going to change anything. So anyhow, I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, ma'am. The name of the book was Blue Zones. Yes. Oh.
I'm really happy that Walmart has started offering more organic vegetables for us to buy. But I do worry with their price point being so low and kind of the way that they've historically pushed their the wires they buy from their suppliers around. Do you think that that is going to lower the quality of those organic products?
So the question is, when you get big companies like Walmart into the organic business, is it really going to stay organic? Well, there's a statistic I read, and I don't know if it's true, but if you add up, supposedly there is twice as much organic food in the United States. I'm sorry, there is twice as much organic food sold in the United States than grown in the United States. And you really have no way to know. And I think your answer is, you're totally at the mercy of the people who are selling. And I buy from a co-op, and I know the guy, and I think he's a pretty straight shooter. But his whole life depends on that farm. And I've actually kind of wondered, if his potato plants are going down the tubes, if one night he kind of sneaks out there and just kind of hits it with a little pesticide because he knows that tomato crop dies, maybe he doesn't pay the mortgage. So we don't really know what goes on. They've done studies where they've gone into restaurants and taken fish and done genetic studies. In some restaurants, 40% of the fish were not what they said they were. They said it was X, and it turned out to be a cheaper cut of fish. So that is a very good point, and I don't know. I don't know how you figure that out. Hopefully there'll be some watchdog group that will look at it and test. Did you see where, was it Walmart, GNC, they just got dinged that a number of their supplements turned out to be very poor quality and lacked a number of the compound they said was in it. So yeah, I think it's a big concern. I mean, how do you police it? And I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on local honey and allergies?
So the question is local honey and allergies. There's been this idea for a long time that if you have seasonal allergies, if you consume local honey, that because it contains the local pollen, that it may desensitize you. Actually, I looked into this from a medical standpoint. There's really almost no scientific evidence to support it. There are people who absolutely swear by it, and it seems to be a lot of anecdotal evidence. So first of all, I don't think taking a teaspoon or a tablespoon of honey is going to hurt, and it may work. The other thing people point out, the naysayers, is if you look at what most people's seasonal allergies are due to is to grasses and weeds. And bees don't pollinate grasses and weeds; they pollinate flowers. So the stuff that is in the pollen that is in honey typically tends to be not the stuff we're allergic to. But my answer to that is, if you want to try it. Now, one thing I would say, I heard about a kid, and this is N equals 1. He decided that instead of going to honey, he would go right to pollen, because you can go to a health food store and you can buy pollen. And he took like a tablespoon of it or something, and really caused quite a significant reaction. So don't do that. If you're going to do it, just get local honey. And that also brings up the question of honey. You really got to be careful. The honey you get in the store that just says honey, a lot of that stuff has been, maybe cut with fructose, high fructose corn syrup. If you really want to get it where, again, assuming it's not bogus, that it is from a local farm, to make sure it's high quality. And I heard someone, well, you want to get it from a big company because you don't want to make sure that it's processed correctly. Honey, nothing grows in honey. They found honey in pyramids that is still edible. Honey has incredible antibacterial properties. If you think about it, if you took sugar, table sugar, put some water in it, mixed it up, and left it in your pantry for 3 months and came back, there'd be fungus and everything. You purposely don't put honey in the refrigerator because it crystallizes, but nothing ever grows in it. So pure farm-grown, local honey is incredibly healthy, incredibly safe, and would be the way to go.
You mentioned that you have a bee hive. Is that a difficult thing for anyone to start in the backyard?
Yeah, actually, there's a huge growth in beekeeping among what's kind of called recreational beekeeping. And in fact, we have a beekeeping club. In fact, it meets tonight at all places. It meets in Monsanto, and there's about 300 people in it. In answer to your question, beekeeping has been called farming for intellectuals. It isn't hard work, but it takes a lot. It's a shame. If you talk to old beekeepers, it used to be you put your bees out in the field, you came back in the fall, you harvested the honey, and that was beekeeping. Now, because of all this stuff, it is a weekly management of trying to keep these mites at bay and all the different things. But it's a lot of fun. But if anybody's interested, I can tell you, but there's a lot of beekeeping groups. And actually, it's wonderful that Monsanto has gotten involved, because they're using their megabucks in power to actually try to figure out a way to fight these nasty mites and take them out. Because if anybody could come up with an effective anti-mite therapy for honeybees, it would just be, astounding. All right, well, I'll be up here for a few minutes. Oh, one.
Thoughts on probiotics?
Question is, or prebiotics. So the question is, what about the health and beneficialness of prebiotics and probiotics? So just the definition, prebiotic, well, first of all, probiotics are good bacteria for your digestive tract. It's something you consume that will, alter the normal bacteria in your digestive tract for the better, whatever that is. And then prebiotics are actually natural compounds that kind of help the good bacteria grow. They're kind of typically complex starches. They have names like fructose oligosaccharide and inulin and all, but basically they're complex starches that the good bacteria feed on and helps them to multiply. There is absolutely, first of all, I think what we're going to find in the next 10 to 20 years is the biggest breakthrough in medicine is going to be understanding our relationship to our gut bacteria, what's called the microbiome. And in fact, a lot of that is going on at WashU. In fact, there's a guy down there, I always kind of joke, his name is Jeff Gordon, who is heading up the project, and he's probably going to win the Nobel Prize. And I think it's just a comment on America that the Jeff Gordon we know is going to win the Nobel Prize and probably change the world of medicine, but a lot more people know the other Jeff Gordon who can drive at 250 miles an hour. But, both of them have their skills, but anyhow. There's no doubt that changing the gut bacteria is very, very useful. And there's no doubt that probiotics help. The trouble is we really don't have any idea what we're doing. It's estimated that in our gut we have 500 to 1,000 different species of bacteria. Most of them, we don't know what they do. We really can't grow them in a culture system. And so, probably the best probiotic out there maybe has 10 to 12 different strains of bacteria, stuff you probably heard of like lactobacillus. Now, there's no doubt that when you give those to people, it does seem to help them, improve their health. But which ones are best? I have patients say all the time, what is the best probiotic? I have no idea. Nobody knows. But I tell people, if you want to use a probiotic, I would, reputable company, one that has multiple different strains, maybe 10 to 12 different strains, and has, many billions of bacteria, 15, 20, 50 billion. Often the better ones, though not always, are refrigerated. And then in terms of the question of a prebiotic, yeah, a lot of them actually come kind of packaged with these complex sugars to help them thrive. But again, it all gets back to if you eat a healthy plant-based diet, you're kind of providing the bacteria with the stuff they like to munch on anyhow. So it all kind of fits together.
Is it sauerkraut?
Yeah, well, she mentioned sauerkraut. The other area that has been done for centuries is fermented foods. And fermented foods can give you billions of a large array of bacteria. That in Asia for years they've used fermented soy like tempeh or miso. One thing people think is that tofu is fermented. It's not. So, but if you want to use tempeh, sauerkraut, one that you can very easily get is kefir in the grocery store. Kefir is fermented milk. And there's a couple good brands there. You can get it at any local grocery store. It tastes like yogurt. It's thinner. It's kind of like thick milk. It's usually flavored with blueberry or something. And I actually take that every morning. I don't know, I think it helps, but anyhow, that's a very simple way to get a lot of good bacteria in your digestive tract. Yes?
So you're trying to remove milk from your diet. What are the good alternatives out there? Soy milk, almond milk, in your opinion, what is the best alternative?
So the question is, if you want to remove milk from your diet, what is the best thing to do? So it's kind of a complicated question, but I'm not a big fan of soy milk personally. Again, you can argue about whether soy is good or bad in terms of breast cancer and some other things like that. But, I think it's a big leap from looking at eating some natural tempeh or whatever in Asia to looking at highly industrialized soy milk. I mean, it takes quite an industrial process to make soy milk. Also, a lot of people find that they're allergic to soy. It makes them very gassy. So I'm just not a real fan. And I can tell you any soy milk you get in the U.S. is going to be genetically modified. Almond milk is good from the standpoint it's just almonds. But the trouble with it is it doesn't really have a lot of protein. It's white water is what it is. I don't think there's any downside, but it's just really white water. So I would say of the two, I would probably go with almond. I think they've come out now with cashew milk, but probably one of the nut milks, but they certainly have a lower level of protein. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, what about multivitamins? And that's a very interesting question. They've been really slammed lately. I think there's a couple issues on that. First of all, there's never really been a study that has come out showing that multivitamins prolong life or whatever, but when you look at it, if you really want to do a study like that, you'd have to take, a kabillion people, have 50% on a multivitamin, 50% not, and follow them for years, and then look at some, mortality outcome, put someone on a group on a multivitamin for 2 or 3 years, and then kind of decide what what the outcome is, obviously kind of foolhardy. So one, we don't know. Second thing, when you look at these studies, they've usually been kind of, do you take a multivitamin or not? Well, there's a whole array of multivitamins. There are ones that are synthetic. There's ones that are more naturally derived. Are they the same? What's the constitution of them? So there's all these questions. So my first thing is, I actually take a multivitamin, and I don't think it's a bad idea from the standpoint of, they're relatively cheap. One of the first rules in medicine is first do no harm. And I just really can't for the life of me see where taking a multivitamin that's, 15, 20 cents a day is going to hurt anybody. And, if they were like $10 or $20 a day, then I would definitely say, well, is it really worth the money? But I mean, essentially they're free. So I take one. But what I think is really, really clear is this love affair with hypervitamins is absolutely wrong. I mean, these people who are taking just, gargantuan amounts of vitamin E or vitamin C, or especially vitamin A, that's very toxic. But, you actually throw the whole system out of whack. So, a multivitamin has vitamins in their kind of normal array. But then these people that just huge amounts, I would not go that way. The one exception probably is 50 to 60, 70% of Americans are vitamin D deficient. And I think getting your vitamin D level up into the normal range, which often takes, 1,000, 2,000 units a day, is very good. And in terms of all the vitamins, actually vitamin D is actually a hormone, it turns out. And it has a lot of very positive effects on anti-inflammatory, cardiovascular, neurocognitive. So that's the one exception of it. But overall, I would say, taking a good multivitamin that has, reasonable amounts but not hyper amounts, it seems to me logical. It all depends on the company. And as I understand vitamins, there's kind of two ways you can make them. Sometimes they can just be synthetically derived, which in sometimes, like I understand, vitamin C that's synthetic is no different than others. Other times there are subtle differences in the compound and a little different than natural ones. So I would look at ones that, claim to be more natural, but it really comes down to the company. Is there a question?
Is there anything that we can take, supplements, work plants, more vegetables to increase your cognitive level? Into your brain capacity decreasing?
So the question is, what about aging? The whole question of healthy aging, how can you prevent that or slow that down? And obviously that's an area of huge interest in research. And the answer to that, tends to be, no one's found kind of the magic bullet. I mean, it basically is doing this kind of stuff. It would be my answer to that, that it's multi-factorial. Type of thing. And then I would also say the other thing is that I didn't really mention about is limiting alcohol consumption. I mean, I'm not saying completely, but excessive alcohol consumption probably is not good in terms of brain aging. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a vitamin that vitamin C is your vitamin?
Never heard that. The question was whether the B complex deter mosquito. As I've never heard that. Anybody heard that? I've not. And okay. It won't hurt you. I mean, one thing about B vitamins is they're water soluble, so they just kind of go in. If you have too much of it, they kind of go at the other end. So. Well, actually, I use something called Isogenics, which is kind of a complete nutritional program that is 100% organic and has a whole array of vitamins, minerals, and it's all 100% natural. So that is kind of what I've been on for years and found it very effective. I think there's other good ones. I've just settled on that because I know it and it's easy. And but yeah, anybody's interested, I can tell you more about it, but I found it to be a very effective program. Yes. Okay, actually, for anyone who's interested, I did leave my card out at the front desk. Yes, ma'am.
You said that stevia was your preferred sweetener. Why do you feel like stevia?
Well, the question is, why is stevia safe? Stevia is a plant product, and it's not artificially created. It's a plant product that, as I understand it, we lack the ability to break down that form of sugar and absorb it, so it kind of just goes through us. So it's sweet, and but it doesn't do anything. The problem with the other ones, aspartame and sucralose and all the other ones, they are chemicals. And again, just tell you the aspartame and sucralose of all of them, I think, are the nastiest. Actually, what sucralose is they take sugar and they bubble or somehow chlorine through it. And generally anytime you chlorinate anything, that's kind of what you do in your pool. It's not really man didn't really need a whole lot of chlorinated compounds in their diet. So, yes.
What's your thought on minimal real sugar intake and like real cream intake for coffee versus like hydrogenated powdered cream?
So the question is, sugar versus cream versus hydrogenated creams. I think unequivocally, I would go with sugar and cream in my coffee. And again, all of this is, I think, I'm not a big dairy fan, again, with the exception of whey protein. Having that much cream in your coffee is not what's killing America. So, I think that a little bit of sugar, if that's what you want, is fine. But yeah, those hydrogenated, those are nasty compounds, and I would really go more natural with that. And small amounts of that. I think the real problem, it's not someone who puts a little sugar and cream in their coffee. It's when you go to Starbucks or Caldi's and get some latte thing that's 500 calories. It's nothing more than a coffee milkshake. That's when the real problem begins. Yes.
You touched on the alkaline diet a little bit, and it's been really big in like celebrity news diet. So I kind of want to hear more about that. Does it help with weight loss or nutrition absorption?
So the question is, what about alkaline diets? And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure. I've heard about all the stars on these alkaline diets, and I'm not exactly sure what they're doing. But my general perception of an alkaline diet is just getting rid of the typically highly acidic foods, the carbonated beverages, lots of processed grains, lots of animal protein, etc. And but exactly what they're doing, I'm not sure. But I think those ideas make a lot of sense. So. All right. Well, I really appreciate all the questions, and I'll be up here for a few minutes if you have any questions. Thanks.